Hey there guys, this is your host Richard with another marvelous video. Jason Voorhees is definitely one of the deadliest slashers ever. He competes in the big leagues along with honorable serial killers like Leatherface and Freddy. But what really separates Jason is the influence the past has on his present. Having appeared in several movies and comics, in this video we'll explore the entire life of Jason Voorhees. I'll begin with the dark history behind Crystal Lake, his hunting ground, before moving on to his early childhood and adult life, followed by his equally vicious appearances in comics. So, without further ado, let's begin. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The grim and gruesome history of Camp Crystal Lake, written in pages of flesh with the ink of blood. Camp Crystal Lake is almost synonymous with Jason, but that wasn't always the case. Long before Crystal Lake became the hunting grounds of Jason, and before him, his mother, the place was home to several generations of peaceful and friendly Indian tribes like the Tillamook's, the Nehalims, and the Nestucca. Lewis and Clark, the great expeditionists who traveled west after the Louisiana Purchase and brought back stories of exotic mountains, rivers, lakes, and animals, also recorded their experiences with the native Indian tribesmen. According to one of their estimates, around 2,200 Indians lived in the region south of the Columbia River, but at the dawn of the 20th century, the number shrunk to 200. So, why this massive decrease in population? Well, the answer is twofold. First, the unwelcoming gift of diseases that the white settlers brought to the native tribesmen proved fatal to many. They didn't have any immunity against these new diseases and started to die. In fact, this is true for several indigenous and untouched tribes even today. For instance, the government of India passed the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Act of 1956 to protect the North Sentinel Islands from any outside contact because the Sentinelese people have no immunity against modern diseases. You may remember it from the news a few years ago when an American missionary man named John Allen Chow went to spread the word of God to the 60,000-year-old tribe, only to die at the hands of the tribesmen. Coming back to Crystal Lake, the second prominent force behind the deaths of several native tribes was the greed that filled the hearts of the white settlers. In order to take over the land, the settlers would carry out genocide, and these grievous crimes often went overlooked, while the culprits would hide from the watchful eyes of the law. Again, this is true for the real world as well. Now, in one such genocide, a group of white settlers massacred an entire tribe of natives before dumping their bodies into Crystal Lake. Some of the men, women, and children who were thrown into the lake hadn't even died before being thrown. So, not only were they grievously wounded, but they also drowned to death with their injuries. In the aftermath, their silent shrieks and spilt blood filled the lake's water. But the white settlers felt that that wasn't enough, so they went after the shaman of the tribe, the leader. It was on the shaman's orders that the tribesmen chose to fight back instead of retreating, and thus the settlers wanted to cut off the root of the problems. The first victim of this second spell of killings was the shaman's wife. Then the settlers turned to the shaman himself, intending to abduct him. Thankfully for the shaman, a group of Tillamook tribesmen arrived at the scene and surrounded the slaughterers. The leader of the settlers asked the shaman to order his tribesmen to drop their weapons. But the proud native leader wouldn't have any more of that, and he asked his men to fight. Clearly, the white guys were enraged, and their leader slit the shaman's throat in one clean sweep on the banks of Crystal Lake. And as his blood started dripping into the lake, he warned that he was immortal and would one day return. The blood that gushed out of his neck seemed to be endless. It turned the entire lake red and added a quarter mile to the circumference of the lake. But no one survived the night, as the lake and the woods around it killed everyone, young and old, white and native. It was believed that one day the lake would take a life, and this unfortunate soul would become the vessel that would carry the hatred that was buried and drowned in the bottom of the lake. At last, Jason Voorhees would become the vessel the dead souls in the cursed lake had been searching for all along. Was it the vengeful shaman who took over the body of little Jason when he was left to drown, or was it the curse of all the natives who were left to die in the lake? Whatever may be the answer, one thing that's clear as crystal is that Jason would become a vengeful monster that was as dark as death itself. Jason's days in the womb, a child conceived in abuse. Pamela and Elias Vorhees married in September of 1947 in Cadiz, Ohio. When speaking to others, Pamela told them she served her husband as a dutiful wife, taking all the interest and love in performing domestic chores. In reality, Elias was a huge, muscular man who was a wife beater, and Pamela would always be scared to death because of Elias. She was practically his slave and agreed to do as he commanded because of the fear of being beaten up. Interestingly, she was also pregnant with a child, but she hadn't told Elias just yet because she feared how he'd react. Pamela lived in a dire situation with a cruel husband, and although grim, it's a life that many wives live. But what's not usual is the fact that Pamela seemed to be able to talk to her unborn child. Days would pass, and Elias would brutally abuse her to the point that sex between them resembled marital rape. Beating the hell out of Pamela for petty and trivial things was the norm in the Voorhees house. Pamela would often discuss with her unborn baby when she would reveal to Elias about her pregnancy, but she could never gather the courage to speak up because of Elias's temper. She was probably scared that he'd hurt her and her baby because pregnancy meant a stop to the lovemaking and the beginning of expenses. But one night, when Elias returned home, he once again brutalized Pamela. She was worried about her baby, and a decision was made right then and there. Her fetus spoke to her and asked her to kill him. Jason's birth and traumatic early years. She got hold of Elias's double-edged axe and struck open Elias's skull while he was still asleep. She was the mastermind of this bloody carnage, and it seems that the event took a toll on the fetus. Pamela then stashed Elias's corpse in the back of the truck and drove it to a riverside, where she dumped the body. She was a pregnant widow with no money or family. Eventually, Pamela drove away from Cadiz and ended up in Crystal Lake. She found a job and home there, and most of all, a safe haven to peacefully raise her child. It wasn't before long that Mr. and Mrs. Christie offered Pamela the job of a chef for 75 kids and a few counselors for the summer camp at Crystal Lake. But before that could come to fruition, Pamela went into labor and delivered Jason. He was diagnosed with several diseases like hydrocephalus, a brain disease in which the body produces excess cerebrospinal fluid, and this condition led to other ailments in Jason like a deformed face, an enlarged head, stunted mental growth, etc. Eventually, Jason turned out to become a troubled and violent kid. Killing little kittens and bathing in their blood was almost a sport to him. Under these circumstances, he couldn't be left alone, and in 1957, Pamela told the Christies that she wouldn't make it that year to the camp. Mrs. Christie suggested that if she brought Jason along, both their problems would get solved. Pamela agreed to it, but that would be the worst mistake for everyone around. Here, Jason witnessed a couple of counselors making out in the woods and ambushed them. One of the counselors chased Jason, and the kid jumped into the lake and drowned. The police ran a combing operation in the lake to find Jason's body, but they came up with nothing, and the case was closed. Pamela was angry at everyone, especially the camp counselors. Camp Crystal Lake saw its first murder in 1958 when an assailant killed 2 counselors who were having sex. By then, Mrs. Voorhees reached the house of the Christies, where another camp counselor rushed out in panic. She revealed that someone had killed everyone inside. And that's how it all started. And as you may have noticed, the events from the comics slightly differ from what happened in the movies, which is what we're really here for. So, let's get to it then. Friday the 13th, 1980. The film starts with a flashback to 1958 at Camp Crystal Lake. 2 counselors, Barry and Claudette, snuck away from a campfire sing-along for some private time. Who am I kidding? They wanted to have sex. Just as things heated up, an unseen attacker crashed their party. Barry tried to tell the attacker it wasn't what it looked like, but he didn't know that he was in a Friday the 13th movie, and the attacker stabbed Barry before chasing down Claudette and slashing her throat. In the present day, it's Friday, June 13th. We meet Annie Phillips, a young woman with plans to work at the reopened camp. She stops at a local diner for directions, and the locals are clearly spooked when they learn about her destination. A friendly truck driver, Enos, offers to take her halfway. As they leave, they're interrupted by the town nutjob, who's aptly named Crazy Ralph. This guy warns Annie about going to Camp Blood. If you think about it, he wasn't that crazy after all. Anyway, they brush him off, but Enos can't stop himself from talking about the camp's dark history during the ride. Drowning, murders, arson. The place is cursed, he tells Annie. But Annie keeps on trekking after Enos drops her off. Quite the optimist. Meanwhile, we meet 3 more counselors, Ned, Jack, and Marcy. Jack and Marcy are a couple, and it's pretty clear Ned's feeling a bit left out. They arrive at the camp and meet Steve Christie, who's leading the renovation effort. Alice Hardy, another counselor, shows them the ropes and points out more work to be done. Alice heads to the lake to find Bill, another counselor, and then hurries back to the main cabins. Back to Annie, she hitches another ride but quickly senses something's off when a driver stays silent and speeds past the camp entrance. Annie panics and leaps out of the moving car but doesn't get far before the driver catches up and slits her throat. So yeah, Camp Blood has already started showing its true colors. Meanwhile, Steve heads to town for supplies, leaving the young counselors to their own devices. What could possibly go wrong? The counselors decide to hit the lake for a swim. Brenda spots something weird in the woods, but brushes it off as nothing. But then Ned pretends to drown, and Brenda and Jack rush to save him. They haul him to the raft, and just when Brenda tries to resuscitate him, Ned kisses her. Apparently, it was all a prank. Later, in her cabin, Alice was getting ready for dinner when she spotted a snake. She screamed for Bill, who came running with a machete. Next thing we know, they're visited by Officer Dorff, who's looking for Crazy Ralph, but none of them have seen him or know about him. The only one who did was Annie, but she's been dead for a while now. Interestingly, Ralph jumps out of the pantry while Alice is prepping dinner with Marcy and Ned. He warns the kids about the camp being cursed before leaving the place. Needless to say, Everyone is spooked. As night falls, a storm hits Crystal Lake. The weather is rather romantic, and Jack and Marcy stroll by the lake while a jealous Ned walks off alone. He spots someone in black slacks, a brown plaid shirt, and a class ring standing outside a cabin. Ned approaches, asking if they need help, and follows them inside. On the other hand, Marcy talks about a recurring nightmare of rain turning to blood. Just as she finishes, the storm gets worse and they head to the cabin. Of course, they start hooking up on a bunk bed, totally unaware that Ned's dead body is right above them, his throat slit. Soon, Marcy heads to the bathroom, leaving Jack alone with the killer hiding under the bed. As Jack lights a cigarette, blood drips on his forehead. The killer grabs Jack and drives an arrow through the bed, right into his throat. Brutal stuff, but not brutal enough yet. While Marcy's in the bathroom, she hears a door creak open and thinks it's just Jack. She leaves the bathroom and, while washing her hands, talks to herself in the mirror. A noise from the showers spooks her, but she brushes it off as a prank. As she checks the showers, an axe emerges from the shadows, and before she can understand what's happening, she finds the axe slamming into her head. Ouch. Meanwhile, Brenda's bored and suggests playing strip Monopoly with Alice and Bill. This is one horny bunch of counselors. I swear to God. The storm blows the door open mid-game, and Brenda heads out to close the cabin windows, calling it a night. As she's settling in with a book, she hears a childlike voice calling for help. Curiosity gets the best of her, and she heads outside into the rain, only to find herself in the archery range. Blinded by the lights, she's trapped by the killer and meets her end off-screen. Bill returns to Alice's cabin and she tells him she heard Brenda scream. They check Brenda's cabin and find a bloody axe in her bed. Panic sets in as they search Jack and Marcy's cabin and the bathrooms but find no one. Bill tries to keep Alice calm, but they know something is seriously wrong. Breaking into Steve's office, they discover the phone lines are cut. Jack's car won't start, and with the storm raging, they decide to wait at the main lodge for Steve. Steve, meanwhile, finishes his meal at a local diner and heads back to the camp, only to get stuck in the mud. A passing cop gives him a ride but has to drop him off due to an emergency call. As Steve walks back, he's stopped by a flashlight at the camp sign. He recognizes the person and asks what they're doing out in the storm, only to be stabbed. The killer then disables the power, which naturally forces Bill to investigate. Fearing for her safety, he insists Alice stays behind. When Bill doesn't return, Alice goes to check the generator cabin and finds his body pinned to the door with arrows. Terrified, she flees back to the main cabin and tries to barricade herself in. Just when she thinks it's safe, Brenda's corpse crashes through the window. Soon, Alice hears a vehicle outside. She bolts out, thinking it's Steve, but instead, she meets Mrs. Voorhees, a seemingly sweet middle-aged woman claiming to be an old friend of the Christies. Well, can't say she was entirely lying. Alice hysterically warns her to stay away, but Mrs. Voorhees insists on checking things out. Inside, she sees Brenda's body and starts ranting about the camp's dark history. Mrs. Voorhees reveals that her son Jason drowned here in 1957 while the counselors were off having sex. She blames them for her son's death, and it's clear she's not all there. When she accuses Alice of being responsible, things get intense. Mrs. Voorhees pulls out a hunting knife, and Alice realizes that she's the killer, thanks to the class ring on her hand. Mrs. Voorhees starts chasing Alice. Alice discovers Annie's body in Mrs. Voorhees' Jeep and Steve's body hanging upside down. Mrs. Voorhees turns the power back on and corners Alice in a storage shed. The young girl finds a shotgun, but the ammo is locked up. It's not before long that Mrs. Voorhees catches up to her and attacks, but Alice narrowly escapes and gets inside the main cabin. Alice hides in the pantry, but Mrs. Voorhees breaks in, now wielding a machete. Alice knocks her out with a frying pan and heads to the lakeside, hoping it's over. But Mrs. Voorhees isn't done. She charges at Alice, who manages to knock the machete out of her hands with a paddle. They wrestle by the lake, and Alice, in self-defense, grabs the machete and decapitates Mrs. Voorhees in one clean stroke. But her horror didn't end there. Exhausted and in shock, she falls asleep on a canoe in the middle of the lake. Morning comes and the police arrive, and just as she sits up, the decomposing corpse of Jason bursts from the water to drag her under. Alice wakes up in a hospital, screaming. She asks about Jason, but the police say that they found no boy in the lake. Alice whispers, "Then he's still there." Friday the 13th, Part 2, 1981. Friday the 13th Part 2 picks up 2 months after the bloody events at Camp Crystal Lake. Alice Hardy is so not over her experience with Mrs. Voorhees and is trying to piece her life back together. She's alone, drawing self-portraits, and nightmares have become a usual trauma to her. One night, after a creepy phone call and a scare from her cat, she discovers Mrs. Voorhees' decaying head in her fridge. Before she can react, An adult Jason Voorhees shows up and stabs her in the temple with an ice pick, thereby avenging his mum's death. The movie then takes a 5-year leap. A new summer training camp for counselors is opening up near the now-abandoned Camp Crystal Lake. Sandy Deer and Jeff Dunsbury, two eager counselors, are heading to Camp Packanack. Along the way, they meet their prankster buddy Ted Bowen. Much like the original film, these new camp counselors also get a warning from the town nutjob Crazy Ralph about their doom if they go to Crystal Lake. Naturally, they ignore him. At Camp Packanack, they meet the owner, Paul Hull, and other counselors. The flirty Scott Cheney, his crush Terry McCarthy, who's playing hard to get, and Mark Jarvis, a wheelchair-bound teen who once met a motorbike accident that left him this way. And finally, there's his admirer, Vicky Perry. Paul lays down some safety rules, but we all know how that usually goes down in Friday the 13th movies, or all horror movies for that matter. Paul's assistant, Ginny Field, arrives late and gets a scolding. It's clear there's some romantic tension between her and Paul. That night, around the campfire, Paul gives the counselors the lowdown on Jason Voorhees. He recounts how Jason drowned and his mum Pamela went on a killing spree. Alice decapitated Pamela, but then someone killed Alice a few years later. Paul leans towards Jason being the killer. Just as things get eerie, Ted jumps out wearing a monster mask, scaring everyone. However, Paul reassures them that Jason is dead, then tells the group to hang out in the main lodge and to stay away from the original campsite. The night continues with Scott trying to charm Terry, Jeff and Sandra dancing, Ginny beating Paul at chess, and Mark arm wrestling with Vicky cheering him on. Ginny heads to her cabin but is met by Paul, and they start making out, because, why not? Crazy Ralph spies on them, but Jason kills him with barbed wire, and just like that, Ralph becomes the first victim of the night. The next day, the counselors engage in training activities. During a swim at the lake, Jeff and Sandra somehow manage to sneak into the now-abandoned Camp Crystal Lake. They get caught by a cop, Deputy Winslow, and are brought back to Paul, who doesn't do much about the trespass, which kinda infuriates Winslow, who caught the kids. While driving away, the cop sees Jason running into the woods and follows him to a dilapidated shanty in the woods. Inside, Jason kills the officer with a hammer claw to the head. Clearly, things are about to get real. But what was this cabin doing in the middle of the woods? Well, it's believed that on the day Jason supposedly drowned, he either found his way to this shanty or built it himself. Regardless, Jason made it his home for an unknown period, and he definitely lived there in June 1979 when his mother Pamela went on her murderous rampage. After her death, Jason took his mother's severed head, her clothes, and the machete used to kill her, and created a shrine in the shack. It served as his lair and a place for human sacrifices, all of which started with Alice Hardy. Anyway, Ted, Ginny, Paul, and the rest of the counselors decide to go to the casino bar for one last hurrah before going their separate ways. Scott, Terry, Vicky, and Mark stay behind, while Jeff and Sandra are grounded at camp as punishment for sneaking off to Camp Crystal Lake earlier. Jason seizes the opportunity and starts picking them off, one counselor at a time. Terry goes skinny dipping, and when Scott steals her clothes, she chases him into the woods. Scott gets caught in a trap, and while he's hanging around waiting for Terry to bring a knife, Jason slashes his throat with a machete. Terry returns to find Scott dead and tries to flee, but Jason gets her too. Meanwhile, Mark and Vicky want to do Boom Boom. Vicky heads to freshen up while Sandra and Jeff go upstairs and get busy. Mark rolls onto the porch in his wheelchair, only to have Jason bury a machete in his face. Jason then arrives at the lodge, grabs Ted's spear, and heads upstairs to where Jeff and Sandra are in bed. He impales them both with the spear and pins them to the bed and floor. Interestingly, this sets up a future plotline where Sandra's brother Rob Dyer seeks revenge. Vicky returns and goes upstairs, only to find Jeff and Sandra dead. She's confronted by Jason, who's now wearing a burlap sack over his head. Jason slashes Vicky's leg and corners her before stabbing her in the stomach. Additionally, Ginny and Paul have left a very drunk Ted behind, and they return to the camp to find that it's been painted in blood. They find the main cabin empty and dark, with blood everywhere, but Jason comes with a pitchfork and attacks. Paul's knocked out cold, and Ginny hides in the bathroom, trying to escape through a window. But Jason is waiting for her. She goes to the kitchen only to find Crazy Ralph's corpse there, and ends up in the lodge. With her car refusing to start, Ginny's chased across the camp. She hides under a bed in another cabin, but a rat scares her so much that she urinates, which tips Jason off. He finds her, but she manages to grab a chainsaw and wounds his arm. As he recovers, she grabs a chair and knocks him out cold. Ginny flees into the woods and stumbles upon the serial killer's shack. Jason starts breaking down the door, and Ginny, in a moment of desperation, wears Pamela's sweater and pretends to be her. The trick works for a moment, but Jason sees his mom's head on the shrine and snaps out of it. Of course, he attacks Ginny and injures her leg. Fortunately for her, Paul shows up and wrestles with Jason, which gives Ginny time to grab the machete and bury it in Jason's shoulder, seemingly killing him. Back at camp, they take refuge in a cabin and hear noises outside. Paul opens the door to find Terry's little dog, Muffin, but their relief is short-lived as Jason smashes through the window and grabs Ginny. The next morning, Ginny is being loaded onto a stretcher and calls out for Paul, who's nowhere to be seen. The final shot is Pamela Vorhees' rotting, decapitated head. Friday the 13th, Part 3, 1982. The third installment of the franchise starts right after the mayhem of Part 2. Jason Voorhees, the deformed and relentless killer, survives getting a machete to the shoulder from Ginny Field and Paul Holt. He stumbles upon a small country store run by Edna and Harold Hockett. Jason makes quick work of them, meat cleaver to Harold's chest, knitting needle to Edna's neck, and grabs some new clothes before heading to Higgins Haven for some more of the good old-fashioned bloodshed. Of course, the filmmakers introduce a fresh batch of teens, to be slaughtered by Jason. These guys are heading to Higgins Haven. There's Chris Higgins, our heroine, who's returning to face her fears after being attacked by a mysterious man 2 years earlier. She's joined by her friends, Debbie, who's pregnant, and her boyfriend, Andy, prankster Shelley Finkelstein, stoner couple Chuck and Chili, and Shelley's blind date, the lively Vera Sanchez. On their way, they encounter Abel, a creepy dude lying on the road who resembles Crazy Ralph and babbles warnings. In fact, he even shows the group a severed eyeball. Grossed out, they don't pay any heed to his warnings and speed off. They arrive at the idyllic Higgins Haven, a pretty beautiful place to be honest, complete with sparkling lake, a barn, and a big cabin. While the others go skinny dipping, Chris checks out the cabin and finds her boyfriend Rick Bombay already there. Oh, just a side note, Jason was hiding out in the barn, biding his time, and no one had any idea about it. Shelley's antics finally go too far when he fakes getting killed with a meat cleaver stuck in his head. It's so over the top that it pisses off Chris and everyone else in the group. Vera decides that she needs to get away for a bit and heads to the store in Rick's car. She takes Shelley along, albeit a bit reluctantly. At the store, they bump into a rowdy biker gang led by Ali, with his sidekicks Loco and Fox. After a brief scuffle inside, Ali goes outside and starts smashing Rick's car's windows. Shelley, not one to back down, gets in the car and runs over the bikers' motorcycles. He and Vera feel like heroes as they drive away. Back at the cabin, Rick is particularly angry when he sees his car wrecked. Chris and Rick decide to go for a drive to cool off. Meanwhile, the biker gang shows up at the property because they want to steal gas from the van. But Jason has other plans. Fox wanders into the bar and Jason kills her by pinning her to a rafter with a pitchfork. Loco goes in next, and Jason impales him too. Ali finds his friend's bodies and tries to fight Jason but gets bludgeoned with a wrench. Not a good day for bad guys, I suppose, and neither for the good ones. As night falls, Jason goes on the hunt. Shelley, still desperate for Vera's affection, dresses up in a wetsuit and hockey mask and scares her at the duck. Yep, a hockey mask. The hockey mask. Vera tells him off, and Shelley sulks away into the barn where Jason attacks him off-screen before stealing his mask and spear gun. Vera drops Shelley's wallet in the lake and wades in to retrieve it. Jason, now wearing Shelley's mask, sneaks up and shoots her in the eye with a spear. Debbie and Andy head upstairs for some alone time. Afterward, Debbie takes a shower while Andy goes for a beer. Jason swings a machete and slices Andy in half. Debbie, now out of the shower, chills in a hammock reading a magazine, only to have blood drip on her. She looks up, sees Andy's mutilated body, and before she can react, Jason stabs her through the chest from under the hammock. Meanwhile, Chris finally speaks about the terrifying encounter she had 2 years ago when a deformed guy attacked her in the woods after she ran away from home. She and Shelley try to drive back, but the car won't start, so they hoof it back to the cabin. Meanwhile, Chuck and Chili were smoking up when the lights went out. Chuck heads to the basement to fix the fuse box and gets electrocuted by Jason. But hey, at least the power comes back on. Chili finds Shelley with his throat slashed, thinks it's a prank at first, but then realizes it's real and freaks out. Next thing we know, she runs into Jason, who kills her with a hot fireplace poker. Chris and Rick finally make it back to the cabin. They're surprised about how eerily quiet the place is, with food burning on the stove. Rick goes outside to check things out while Chris goes upstairs and finds a bathtub full of blood and Chili's bloody clothes. She rushes downstairs looking for Rick, but doesn't know that Jason is crushing his head outside. Oh, and Jason continues until one of Rick's eyeballs pops out. Jason throws Rick's corpse through a window and enters inside. Meanwhile, Chris, who was now upstairs, drops a bookshelf on Jason and hides in a closet where she finds Debbie's body. Jason hacks his way in, but Chris stabs him and manages to escape by smashing a window. Jason grabs her jacket, but she breaks free, hits him with a log, and flees in her van. She tries to run Jason over but misses. The van stalls at a bridge because the bikers had stolen the gas earlier. She switches to the reserve tank. But you know how injuries and insults work? Yeah. So, the bridge starts collapsing. Jason grabs her through the window, but she traps his arms and escapes before running into the woods. Chris heads to the barn and hides in the rafters. Jason locks the door and starts searching for her, but he doesn't realize that she's right above him. When he finally spots her, she drops down, knocking him out in the process, but only for a moment. Jason grabs his machete and nearly gets her, but Chris knocks him out with a shovel, ties a noose around his neck, and hangs him from the barn's hayloft. Thinking she's finally gotten rid of Jason, Chris starts to leave the barn, but he slips out of the noose and she can finally see his face. She realizes it's the same psycho who attacked her 2 years ago. Jason charges at her, machete raised high and vengeful anger raised higher. Just when it looks like curtains for Chris, Ali, remember the biker guy, shows up. Although he's badly injured, he's ready to fight. He tries to take on Jason but gets his arm chopped off and is hacked to death. While Jason is busy with Ali, Chris grabs an axe and buries it in Jason's forehead. Even then, Jason stumbles towards her before finally collapsing, supposedly dead. Chris is completely freaked out and heads down to the lake, grabs a canoe, and rows away. The next morning, she sees Jason's unmasked, bloodied face glaring at her from the cabin window and then charging at her. She screams, tries to escape, but suddenly realizes it was just a hallucination when everything looks normal again. But then, out of nowhere, the rotted corpse of Pamela Vorhees drags her into the lake. Thankfully, she wakes up and realizes it was all a nightmare. In the final scene, a cop escorts a traumatized Chris out of the cabin, and she's laughing and screaming hysterically. The camera then cuts to Jason's body, still lying on the barn floor with the axe in his head. Friday the 13th, the final chapter, 1984. The film starts with cops and paramedics all over Crystal Lake's Higgins Haven. Yep, someone had to clean up the carnage from the previous night's massacre. They load up the bodies of the slaughtered teenagers into ambulances while their families mourn at the hospital. Among the bodies is the supposedly dead Jason Voorhees. After getting an axe to the head, everyone assumes he's dead and ships him off to the Wessex County morgue. That night, surprise, surprise, Jason wakes up. Of course, he murders coroner Axel Burns. He then gets Nurse Robbie Morgan with a scalpel and heads straight back to Crystal Lake. The next afternoon, a bunch of teenagers head to Crystal Lake for what they think will be a fun weekend. We've got couples like Paul and Samantha, Doug and Sarah, plus jokester Ted and his buddy Jimmy, who's recently had a breakup. On their way, they spot Pamela Vorhees' gravestone and also pass by a hitchhiker but don't have room to pick her up. Unfortunately for her, Jason shows up and stabs her in the neck. The teens ditch the car to hike to the rented cabin and run into local twins Tina and Terry, who were out biking. Most of them, except Sarah, decide to go skinny dipping. Meanwhile, Trish and her little brother Tommy Jarvis, who live next door, drive by after a store run. The group invites Trish to join their party, but she's more focused on shielding Tommy from the nudity. Well, at least one person has their priorities straight. Their car breaks down in the forest, but a stranger named Rob, who says he's hunting bears, helps them out. Strangely, there were not supposed to be any bears in the area, and even young Tommy knew that. Trish is grateful and drives Rob to her house, where he meets their mom, Mrs. Jarvis, and checks out Tommy's homemade Halloween masks. After that, Rob heads out to set up camp, and Trish and Tommy go back to the store for more supplies. As night sets in, the teenagers kick off their party, joined by the twins, Tina and Terry. However, Samantha gets pissed at Paul for dancing with one of the twins. She storms off to skinny dip in the lake, hoping to cool down. I mean, are there no other ways to calm down apart from throwing off your clothes and jumping into water? Anyway, she spots a raft, swims out, and climbs on to relax. Bad move, of course, because Jason was looking beneath, and he didn't waste any time stabbing her through the stomach. Feeling guilty, Paul goes looking for Samantha. He finds her body in the raft and freaks out. He swims back to shore for help, but Jason is waiting and impales him through the groin with a spear. Rob hears Paul screams and investigates, but finds nothing. When he gets back, he sees Jason has trashed his tent and destroyed his gun. Meanwhile, back at the party, Jimmy and Tina are getting cozy, which annoys Ted. Jimmy and Tina head upstairs for some alone time, leaving Ted to find a vintage stag film, which he sets up for everyone to watch. Terry, fed up with Ted, decides to leave, only to get impaled by the same spear that killed Paul. Next door, Mrs. Jarvis goes out to check on a power outage, and Jason kills her as well. Doug and Sarah are unaware of the carnage, so they conveniently decide to take the relationship to the next level and head upstairs for a shower. Jimmy, after his romp with Tina, goes downstairs to brag to Ted with Tina's underwear but finds Ted too drunk to care. In the kitchen, Jason stabs Jimmy's hand with a corkscrew and then cleaves his head with a meat cleaver. Meanwhile, as Tina gets dressed, she notices Terry's bike still outside. She goes to the window to look for her sister, but Jason bursts through the glass, grabs her, and throws her onto a parked car, which instantly kills her. Next door, Trish and Tommy get back from the store and find their house, curiously, empty. Trish heads out to Rob's tent to see what's up. Rob almost kills her with a machete, mistaking her for Jason. He explains he's actually there to avenge his sister Sandra and her boyfriend Jeff, who Jason killed in part 2. Trish is skeptical, but the weird silence around them leaves her uneasy. Meanwhile, Jason's back at the rental house and he's not done. He sneaks in and kills Ted by stabbing him through the head from behind the projector screen. Upstairs, Sarah finishes her shower and while drying her hair, Jason crushes Doug's head against the bathroom wall. Sarah freaks out when she finds Doug's head and frantically calls for help. She runs downstairs, but Jason hurls an axe through the door, which hits her in the chest. Trish, Rob, and the family dog Gordon head over to check on the teens. They find the house empty and start searching. Rob and Trish check the basement first, but something spooks Gordon so bad he jumps out the window and bolts. Trish goes upstairs and finds Doug's body with the shower still running. She realizes Jason is still alive and rushes back to Rob. As they head upstairs, the stairs collapse. Jason attacks Rob, who tells Trish to run while he fights Jason. On the other hand, Trish escapes with Rob's machete. She runs home and starts nailing the door shut, but Jason throws Rob's body through a window to get in. He hurls a hammer at Trish, but misses by inches. She and Tommy retreat to Tommy's room and try to block the door. Jason hacks at the door with an axe, so Trish smashes a computer monitor on his head. It doesn't do much and only slows him down. Trish uses the window of opportunity to lure Jason to the rental house in the hope of buying Tommy enough time to escape. Tommy stumbles upon Rob's newspaper clippings about Jason, including a picture of Jason as a kid. Remembering how Ginny tricked Jason in part 2, Tommy shaves his head to look like young Jason. You see, he wanted to mess with Jason's mind. Smart kid. Trish comes back, all banged up from falling out of the rental house window, and freaks out when she sees Tommy still in the house. Jason barges in, and Trish, exhausted, takes a couple of swings with a machete. She manages to split his hand and stab his chest, but it barely slows him down. Jason starts strangling Trish, but then Tommy comes down and yells at Jason. Tommy's plan works. Jason gets confused, just like he did with Ginny pretending to be his mum. Trish tries to strike again, but only manages to knock off Jason's mask, and his grotesque face is revealed once again. She's paralyzed with horror, which gives Jason the chance to finish her off. But Tommy steps in, grabs the machete, and buries it in Jason's skull, and the serial killer finally goes down. Thinking it's all over, Tommy and Trish hug. But then Jason's hand twitches. Tommy loses it, grabs the machete again, and goes berserk. He hacks at Jason's body, screaming, "Die!" While Trish screams for him to stop. Cut to a few days later, Trish is in a hospital bed while talking to a doctor about Tommy's behavior. The doctor says there's nothing abnormal. Tommy, with some hair growing back, walks in and they hug. But the final shot is Tommy looking back with a stare that says that Jason lives in Tommy. Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. 1985. In this one, Jason only appeared in dream sequences and hallucinations. So, let's swiftly move on to the next film.
Jake, listen to that!
Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives, 1986. Jason Voorhees has been dead and buried for years. But Tommy Jarvis, who killed Jason when he was just 12, can't shake the trauma and feels that Jason might not truly be dead. Furthermore, because of the incident, he's been bouncing around different mental institutions ever since. Desperate to put his demons to rest, Tommy escapes from his current hospital with his buddy, Alan Horse. They head to Eternal Peace Cemetery because they want to exhume Jason's corpse and cremate it to give him some peace and find some for themselves. They dig up Jason's body and Tom gets overcome by rage and memories of the killer who murdered his mum. He grabs an iron fence post and starts stabbing Jason's corpse over and over and leaves the post stuck in the body. He douses the corpse in lighter fluid, ready to torch it, but then it starts pouring rain. Needless to say, the fire plans are bust. Suddenly, lightning strikes the metal post and reanimates Jason via a freak electric shock. So, this was the first time that the movies hinted at something supernatural about our friend Jason. Up until now, he was simply someone who survived because of his will and strength. But now, he's become something more than human. He's become someone who can't be killed. Jason springs to life and attacks Tommy. Alan tries to help and smacks Jason with a shovel, but it shatters on impact. Jason retaliates by punching through Alan's chest, and he kinda rips out Alan's heart. Yeah, to make it creepier, he throws the heart into the now empty grave. Tommy manages to escape and races off to warn the folks in Crystal Lake, while Jason, now wearing a hockey mask Tommy brought along and armed with the iron fence post, begins his march back to his old hunting grounds. Tommy speeds to Crystal Lake, now renamed Forest Green, to escape its dark past. He tries to warn Sheriff Mike Garris about Jason's return, but the sheriff thinks he's lost it and locks him up. You can't really blame the sheriff, knowing Tommy's been in and out of mental institutions. The next morning, Megan Garris and her friends arrive at the police station because Darren and Lisbeth are missing. Tommy, still locked up, tries to tell them that Jason may be the likely perp, but Sheriff Garris shuts him up. Despite Daddy's frowns, Megan's kinda into Tommy's whole bad boy vibe. More like mad boy vibes. Anyway, the sheriff promises to look for the missing duo, but shoos everyone away and personally escorts Tommy out of town. Tommy manages to get into the cemetery to show the sheriff Jason's supposed resting place, only to find the grave looking too neat, thanks to Martin, the groundskeeper, who covered the tracks to avoid blame, and he mistakenly buries Alan instead of Jason. Sheriff Garris cuffs Tommy and kicks him out of town for good. Meanwhile, in the woods, 5 business people are playing paintball, and let's just say they don't fare well after Jason joins the game. Sheriff Garris and his men soon stumble upon a horror show. Bodies everywhere, and he's convinced Tommy's the slasher behind it all. Meanwhile, Tommy rings up Megan and tells her his plan to chain Jason to the bottom of Crystal Lake to end this nightmare once and for all. Megan's down to help, but a cop roadblock throws a wrench in their escape plan. Finally, they end up at the station, but not for long. Anyway, over at the camp, Jason is lurking for his victims. He spares a few kids, which is clearly a rare moment of softness, but we gotta remember that it can be related to the fact that he once drowned as a kid. Having said that, he goes full beast mode on Sissy and Paula. Tommy and Megan bust out of the station and race to set up a trap for Jason at the lake. Meanwhile, Sheriff Garris and his deputies catch up, but they're out of their league. Jason's relentless. The sheriff also learns that Tommy was right all along, but only after getting snapped in half, so it was kinda pointless by that time. As Tommy and Jason duke it out on the lake, Tommy baits Jason into the lake, locks a chain around his neck, and tries to sink him with a boulder. But Jason drags Tommy underwater too. Megan dives in, turns on the boat's propeller, and gives Jason a pretty sick face job. Next, she drags Tommy back to shore, who's barely alive. And although Jason seemingly drowns, we know better. Friday the 13th, Part 7. The New Blood, 1988. Alright, so after Jason gets chained up at the bottom of Crystal Lake in the last movie, we meet the 10-year-old Tina Shepard. She had a rough and abusive childhood because of her father. One night, she got so mad that she accidentally unlocked and used her telekinetic powers to collapse the dock, and her dad drowned under it. 7 years later, Tina turns 17 and returns to Crystal Lake with her mum and her sketchy doctor, Dr. Cruz. He's supposed to help her deal with her trauma, but he's kinda shady, and figuring out his real intentions isn't easy. One night, Tina is out by the lake wishing she could bring her dad back. Instead of dear old dad, she accidentally resurrects Jason by snapping the chains that were keeping him down. In the aftermath, Dr. Cruz tries to gaslight her by telling her that she imagined the whole thing, but Tina knows what she saw. Meanwhile, a group of friends is nearby for Nick's cousin Michael's birthday, but before Michael and his girlfriend Jane can join the party, their car breaks down. Of course, Jason smells the broken down car like a hungry shark smells blood and shows up. Sure enough, things get brutal fast. Jane gets a spike shoved down her throat, and Michael gets the same spike in the back. Tina, with her powers, gets a vision of Michael's gruesome death and sees the spike on the porch. Dr. Cruz brushes it off as another delusion, and when Tina checks again, the spike is gone. Next, Jason attacks two campers, Dan and Judy. Poor Judy gets slammed against a tree while still in her sleeping bag, and Jason takes Dan's machete. Then Russell and Sandra head to the lake, but they never return, so you can guess what happened to them. Actually, I'll tell you what happened to them. Jason landed an axe in Russell's face and dragged Sandra underwater, drowning her. Maddie is next on Jason's hit list, and she meets her end in the barn with a scythe. Then he crashes Ben and Kate's makeout session in the van because no Friday the 13th movie is ever complete without Jason killing lovers in the act. He crushes Ben's face and sticks a party horn into Kate's eye. Ouch. Meanwhile, Melissa tries to make Nick jealous by using Eddie, but Jason soon takes out David, Eddie, and Robin one by one. Meanwhile, Tina's mom, Mrs. Shepard, decides it's time to leave Camp Crystal Lake for good for Tina's sake. She also discovers a spike in Dr. Cruz's office, and while watching a tape, learns he's been exploiting Tina's powers by keeping her stressed for his own twisted experiments. Tina overhears them arguing and takes off when she hears that Cruz is planning to send her back to the mental hospital. Mrs. Shepard and Cruz go searching for her, but Tina returns with Nick after seeing a vision of her mum getting killed by Jason. They dig into Cruz's office and find out he'd been researching Jason and that he was piecing together his identity. Jason catches Mrs. Shepard and Cruz, and in a pretty cowardly act, Cruz uses her as a human shield while Jason kills her. Tina finds out and runs off, only for Jason to kill Cruz with a tree trimming saw. Tina discovers her mum and the bodies of the teens next door and confronts Jason. Her telekinetic powers come in handy, which she uses to fight Jason. Back at the house, Tina warns Nick and Melissa about whatever's going on, but silly Melissa doesn't buy it until it's too late. Of course, Jason axes her in the face and tosses her body over a table. Tina and Jason have an epic fight, where she manages to break his hockey mask. She sets him on fire and blows up the house. But Jason keeps coming. He knocks Nick out. And just when things look bleak, Tina summons the spirit of her dad who drags Jason back to the bottom of Crystal Lake. In the end, Tina and Nick are taken away in an ambulance. Nick asks about Jason and Tina simply says, "We took care of him." Classic. Friday the 13th, Part 8. Jason Takes Manhattan, 1989. Two teenagers, Jim and Susie, are chilling on Jim's boat at Crystal Lake. As soon as they pass by the abandoned camp, Jim starts telling Susie the legend of Jason Voorhees. Just then, the boat's anchor catches a power cable and drags it onto Jason's comatose body, which gives him a jolt back to life. Jim tries to scare Susie with a fake Jason mask, but the real deal shows up, freshly revived, and takes Jim out with a harpoon gun. Jason then grabs the mask for himself. Susie tries to hide in the boat's cargo hold, but Jason finds her and finishes the job with the harpoon. Unlike all of us, Jason doesn't procrastinate when it comes to work. The next day, Principal Charles McCulloch and teacher Colleen Van Dusen take the students on the SS Lazarus for a cruise to New York City. The crew includes Rennie, McCulloch's niece, and other teens like Julius, Eva, Wayne, Tamara, Sean, Miles, JJ, and Sean's dad, Admiral Robertson, who's the captain. But guess who's also hitching a ride? Yeah, you guessed it right. Jason wastes no time and begins his latest killing spree by beating JJ to death with her own guitar. Meanwhile, the ship's deckhand, who's a lot like Crazy Ralph from earlier films, keeps rambling on about Jason and how everyone's doomed. We know that he's not wrong, but the folks on the cruise don't. After getting into a scuffle with Julius, this unnamed boxer tries to relax in the sauna. Bad decision. Jason plunges a sauna rock into his gut, ending his relaxation permanently, or maybe making his relaxation permanent. You know, the glass could be half full or half empty. Later, Jason takes out Tamara with a shard of a mirror, just as cold-blooded as ever. He then harpoons Chief Petty Officer Jim Carlson and slits the throat of Sean's dad, Admiral Robertson. So as death starts to span its ugly wings across the cruise, a few, like Charles, refuse to believe Jason is back, but others, like Julius, are in no mood to wait for a confirmation. He arms up with the students and hunts Jason. Jason strangles Eva, and when Wayne, now half blind without his glasses, accidentally shoots a crew member, Jason electrocutes him and sets off the fire alarm. Charles blames the deckhand for the chaos and thinks that he's trying to cause panic. Miles gets chased by Jason, a chase that ends with Jason throwing him onto the ship's radio antenna. Julius discovers Miles' body but gets tossed into the ocean by Jason. Meanwhile, Charles finds the deckhand dead with an axe in his back. In the chaos, Charles, Colleen, Julius, Sean, Rennie, and their dog Toby escape on a lifeboat. They finally reach New York, but Jason follows them there as well. He spots a giant hockey billboard and tilts his head like seriously? Anyway, the kids bump into a couple of criminals, Holmes and Jojo, who scare Toby off and abduct Rennie. They inject the poor girl with heroin and attempt to assault her, but Jason intervenes like a blessing in disguise and stabs Holmes with the empty syringe. Jojo tries to fend off Jason with a gun, but bullets are just a nuisance to him. Jason bashes Jojo's head against a pipe, and not only does the perp die, but he breaks the pipe as well. Anyway, this gives Rennie enough time to escape, but Jason follows her. Julius, armed with nothing but his boxing skills, encounters Jason on a rooftop. He gives it his all, but Julius tires out, and Jason finishes him off with a single punch, decapitating him. Meanwhile, Rennie, Sean, Charles, and Colleen find a cop and get into his car, only to discover Julius's severed head in the front seat. Before the cop can call for backup, Jason kills him. Rennie takes the wheel and tries to run Jason down. She succeeds, but swerves when she sees a vision of young Jason and crashes into a wall. Sean, Rennie, and Charles escape before the car explodes, but Colleen isn't so lucky. Rennie then recalls a traumatic memory of Charles pushing her into Crystal Lake to teach her to swim, where she was pulled under by young Jason. She flees and Sean follow, leaving Charles behind. Jason catches up to Charles, throws him through a window, and drowns him in a barrel of toxic sewage. Jason then chases Rennie and Sean into the subway. They manage to electrocute him on the tracks, but of course, Jason survives. The chase leads to a diner, where Rennie frantically tells a waitress about the maniac chasing them. The waitress dismisses it, saying that's just New York. Then, Jason crashes through the door and throws the manager against a mirror like he's nothing. The other patrons scramble to escape, but Jason ignores them as he's fixated on Rennie and Sean. Next, the chase heads into the sewers, where a sanitation worker warns Rennie and Sean the place floods with toxic waste every night at midnight, and they've only got 10 minutes. Before he can lead them out, Jason kills him with his own wrench. He then goes after Sean, but Rennie distracts him and tells him, "You didn't get me in the lake, and you're not gonna get me now." Jason chases Rennie, who manages to find a small barrel of toxic waste. She throws it in Jason's face, and he pulls off his mask. Horrified, she runs as Jason screams in agony. The sludge eats through his mask's eye holes and burns his face. Rennie and Sean keep running, with Jason hot on the trail. They climb up a ladder just as the sewers flood with toxic waste, which sweeps Jason away and presumably kills him. Rennie hallucinates Jason reverting to a child, but is actually washed away into the ocean. In the end, Rennie and Sean emerge and reunite with their dog, Toby. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, 1993. The movie picks up after Jason takes Manhattan. A young woman arrives at Camp Crystal Lake, takes a bath in one of the cabins, and suddenly the lights go out. When she checks it out, Jason Voorhees, somehow resurrected, attacks her. He chases her into the woods but then gets ambushed by an FBI Special Ops team. They unload a hail of bullets and finish him off with an airstrike, blowing him to pieces. Turns out the woman is Agent Elizabeth Marcus, who baited Jason into the trap after his rampage in Manhattan caught the FBI's attention. As the team celebrates, a mysterious figure watches them, who's skeptical of their so-called victory. Meanwhile, Jason's dark heart is still beating. Jason's remains are taken to a morgue in Ohio. Coroner Phil gets hypnotized by Jason's still beating heart and eats it, which allows Jason's spirit to possess him. Now Phil Jason. He kills his assistant with a probe and takes out the two FBI agents guarding the autopsy room before escaping. Elsewhere, a sensationalist newscaster, Robert Campbell, interviews bounty hunter Creighton Duke, who happens to be an expert on Jason. Duke witnesses the FBI ambush and explains that Jason will keep coming back and that he's the only one who knows how to stop him for good. After the interview, Duke goes to Joey B's diner, where Diana Kimball works. and he tries to warn her, but Sheriff Ed Landis arrests him for harassment. Phil Jason heads back to Camp Crystal Lake, where 3 teenagers, Alex, Deborah, and Luke, are camping to celebrate Jason's supposed death. Of course, they go skinny dipping, and afterward, Deborah and Luke head to the tent to get busy, while Alexis crashes in a sleeping bag. Now, when nature calls Alex, Phil Jason hears the call too, and he slashes her to death with a scalpel. A bit later, Deborah steps out for a condom and a bathroom break, then returns to Luke. Once again, Phil Jason impales her with a metal pole and then kills Luke. Phil Jason kidnaps Deputy Josh, kills his girlfriend Edna, and drags him to the old Voorhees house. There, he restrains and shaves Josh before transferring his soul into Josh's body through this creepy black snake-like demon thing. Now, as Josh Jason, he attacks Diana at her home. Stephen Freeman, Diana's son-in-law, shows up just in time to rescue her and stabs Josh Jason with a fire poker. But Josh Jason mortally wounds Diana before escaping. With her dying breath, Diana tells Stephen to protect her daughter Jessica and granddaughter Stephanie. Stephen gets framed for Diana's murder and lands in jail, where he meets Creighton Duke. Duke explains that Jason can only be killed permanently by a blood relative. If Jason possesses a blood relative, he can resurrect fully. That means Jessica and baby Stephanie are in danger. Stephen escapes and heads to Joey B's diner, where Diana works. He meets his daughter for the first time and borrows a car from Ward, a colleague of Diana's who eventually believes in Stephen's innocence. Stephen heads to the old Voorhees house, looking for evidence to clear his name. He falls through the floorboards and discovers that Robert Campbell, Jessica's current boyfriend and a sleazy newscaster, stole Diana's corpse to boost his show's rating. Just then, Josh Jason bursts in and transfers his soul into Robert, leaving Josh's body to dissolve into a bloody mess. Robert Jason heads off, and Stephen follows to save Jessica, who's taking a bath in the house. They run over Robert Jason with Ward's car, but Jessica still doesn't trust Stephen, and she abandons him on the roadside. This time, Stephen gets arrested by his buddy, Officer Randy Parker, but he goes along with it since Jessica's at the station. Robert Jason recovers from his injuries and goes on another rampage and slaughters most of the police force. He almost possesses Jessica before Stephen, still in handcuffs, knocks out Officer Randy, grabs his gun, and shoots Robert Jason. Realizing Stephen was telling the truth, Jessica follows him to Joey B's diner to get Stephanie. But Joey, who was under the impression that Stephen killed Diana, threatens them until Jessica disarms her. The gun goes off and hits the fuse box, which causes a blackout. Damn, too many things are happening. Anyway, Robert Jason shows up and kills Ward by snapping his wrist until the bone tears out. He forces his way inside, deep fries Shelly B's head, and punches Joey so hard her jaw gets shoved into her mouth, killing her. Vicky Sanders puts up a fight with a shotgun and barbecue skewer, but gets pulled into the skewer and has her head crushed. On the other hand, Sheriff Ed Landis and Officer Randy arrive, Robert Jason transfers his soul into Randy. Meanwhile, Duke, who escaped earlier, has Stephanie at the Voorhees house and demands Jessica meet him there alone. Naturally, Stephen grabs a machete from the wrecked diner and follows. At the old mansion, Jessica finds Duke, who gives her this magic dagger and explains only a Voorhees blood relative can either resurrect or permanently destroy Jason. Duke then falls through weak floorboards, injuring his leg. Randy, Jason, and Landis show up separately. Landis accidentally kills himself with the dagger, and Jessica drops it under a dresser. Randy Jason tries to possess Stephanie, but Stephen severs Randy's head with his machete. Jason's heart, which now looks like a demonic infant, crawls out of Randy's neck and falls to the basement. Jessica and Stephen help Duke out, but Jason's heart revives Diana's corpse, and it brings Jason back to his original form with the hockey mask and all the vengeful rage. Jessica and Stephen scramble to find the magic dagger while Duke tries to stall Jason by cuffing him. Jason retaliates with a spine-crushing bear hug, which seriously injures Duke. Fun fact from director Adam Marcus, Duke survives this. Anyway, Stephen, fueled by rage, tackles Jason, but the undead serial killer keeps getting the upper hand. In the end, Jessica kicks the dagger deeper into Jason's heart. Energy bursts from Jason's wound, and demonic hands emerge from the ground, which drag him down to hell. As dawn breaks, Jessica and Stephen kiss and walk off into the sunrise with their daughter, thinking the nightmare is over. But wait, there's one last twist. The dog sniffs around and tries to dig up Jason's discarded mask. Suddenly, Freddy Krueger's iconic clawed glove bursts from the ground, snatches the mask, and pulls it under. I'm sure you know what's next. Jason X, 2002. In 2008, the US government finally captured Jason Voorhees and locked him up at the Crystal Lake Research Facility. 2 years later, in 2010, after multiple failed attempts to kill him, scientist Rowan LaFontaine suggests freezing him. But before they can, Jason breaks free and slaughters the soldiers and Dr. Wimmer. Then Rowan lures him into a cryogenic pod, but he stabs her before they both get frozen. We move a few hundred years into the future to 2455, and Earth is so trashed that humanity has moved to Earth 2. Professor Lowe, his android KM-14, and a bunch of students on a field trip to the old Crystal Lake facility find frozen Jason and Rowan. They bring them aboard their spaceship, the Grendel. They revive Rowan and leave Jason in the morgue because they think he's dead. Well, yeah, he's not dead. No surprises there. Eventually, Jason wakes up and resumes his murder spree by freezing Adrian's face with liquid nitrogen and smashing it into pieces. This was new. He then grabs a surgical machete and kills Stoney while he's having sex with Kinser. Sergeant Brodsky and his team try to take him down, but Jason picks them off one by one. Lowe, desperate for cash, calls his backer Perez, who thinks Jason's body could be valuable. But Jason kills Lou, the pilot, which makes the ship crash into the Solaris space station. The station gets destroyed, and everyone on board dies as well. Jason then reclaims his machete and decapitates Lowe. The survivors try to escape, and sooner on upgrades KM-14 to take on Jason. Despite her impressive new combat skills, Jason eventually overpowers her, but not before he's knocked into a medical station equipped with nanites. These nanites rebuild Jason into an even more powerful cyborg. Yeah, Jason X. Jason punches a hole through the hull that sucks Janessa into space. Brodsky, in an EVA suit, goes outside to fix a power failure with the docking door. To buy time, the crew creates a holographic simulation of Camp Crystal Lake. Jason quickly sees through the ruse, but it gives them enough time to fix the door. In the final moments, Brodsky intercepts Jason as he's propelled toward the escaping survivors, and they both burn up on re-entry into Earth-2's atmosphere. Sooner on, Rowan and KM-14 survive, although KM-14 would need a new body, it seems. On Earth-2, two teenagers by a lake see what they think is a falling star, but it's actually Jason's charred mask sinking to the bottom. Freddy vs. Jason, 2003. Freddy Krueger was stuck in hell, powerless because the folks in Springwood had wiped him from memory. Desperate to regain his power, Freddy resurrects Jason Voorhees and disguises himself as Jason's mom, Pamela. He convinces Jason to head to Elm Street to stir up some fear, hoping this will help him regain his strength. Jason gets to work immediately. Told you this guy doesn't procrastinate when it comes to work. He crashes a sleepover at Laurie Campbell's house and brutally murders Trey, Gibbs' awful boyfriend. The cops suspect Freddy, but at the same time, they try to keep his possible return under wraps. Jason then decapitates Blake's dad and kills Blake, which the police frame as a murder-suicide. Meanwhile, Laurie's ex-boyfriend Will and his buddy Mark, who have been locked up in the psych ward for their Freddy-related experiences, escape after seeing the news about the killings. They head back to Springwood to warn Laurie. That night, Laurie and her friends go to a rave in a cornfield. Freddy tries to kill Gibb in her dreams, but Jason gets her first, along with several other partygoers. Freddy's pissed because Jason's rampage is stealing his potential victims. Clearly, Freddy didn't think his plan would backfire. Anyway, Laurie, Will, and their friends, Kia, Charlie, and Stoner Bill, manage to escape the rave chaos. After a tense encounter with Laurie's dad, Laurie and Will see Freddy killing Mark. They join forces with Deputy Stubbs, believing that Jason is actually a copycat killer of Jason. Fortunately, though, they see through Freddy's plan. They head to Western Hills for Hypnocell, a dream suppressant, but Freddy possesses Bill and makes him destroy the Hypnocell. Jason shows up, kills a security guard, and electrocutes Stubbs. Freddy, through Bill, tranquilizes Jason and sends him to sleep after getting sliced in half. The group devises a plan to bring Freddy into the real world to fight Jason. They haul Jason's unconscious body to Camp Crystal Lake. In the dream world, Freddy and Jason duke it out. Freddy exploits Jason's fear of drowning and reverts him to his younger self. Laurie enters the dream to save Jason and learns Freddy killed her mom. Jason wakes up and starts tearing through the teens, and in the process, he kills Lindemann. Meanwhile, Laurie pulls Freddy into the real world at Camp Crystal Lake, and the battle is on. Freddy and Jason clash all over the campgrounds. Jason kills Kia, and Freddy uses the construction site to gain the upper hand. He cuts off Jason's fingers and grabs his machete. As Freddy slices Jason up, Laurie distracts him and Jason punches his fingerless hand through Freddy's torso. Freddy stabs Jason with the machete and Jason rips off Freddy's gloved arm. Laurie and Will set the dock on fire, which causes propane tanks to explode. Next thing we know, both the undead titans are tossed into the lake. Laurie beheads Freddy with Jason's machete just as he's about to kill her and Will. And as for Jason, well, he falls into the lake and seemingly dies. The next morning, Jason emerges holding Freddy's head. Freddy winks and laughs, and we never get to know who really won. But the franchise kinda ended here until the reboot happened a few years later. Friday the 13th, 2009. On June 13, 1980, young Jason Voorhees watches his mom Pamela get beheaded by a camp counselor at Camp Crystal Lake. Nearly 30 years later, a group of friends, Wade, Richie, Amanda, Mike, and Whitney, head to Crystal Lake looking for some wild-grown weed. That night, Jason, now grown and deadly, massacres everyone except Whitney, who he captures because she looks like his mum. 6 weeks pass and a new group arrives. Trent, his girlfriend Jenna, and their friends Bree, Chelsea, Nolan, Chewie, and Lawrence, all of who stay at Trent's summer cabin by the lake. Meanwhile, despite the local sheriff's warnings, Whitney's brother Clay is searching for her. Clay visits Trent's cabin and Jenna decides to help him look for Whitney. While Chelsea and Nolan are wakeboarding, Jason kills Nolan with an arrow and fatally stabs Chelsea with his machete. Clay and Jenna stumble upon Jason dragging a body at the old campgrounds, and they rush back to warn the others. Chewie, off in a tool shed, gets killed by Jason, while Trent and Bree are busy hooking up. Jason cuts the cabin's power and Lawrence gets an axe to the chest. Bree is the next to go when Jason sneaks inside. A cop shows up but gets taken out by Jason before he can help. Trent, Clay, and Jenna flee but get separated. Trent reaches the main road only to be skewered by Jason. Clay and Jenna find Jason's lair and discover Whitney chained up. They free her and try to escape, but Jenna gets impaled by Jason. Clay and Whitney end up in a barn, where Whitney tricks Jason by pretending to be Pamela. They manage to subdue him with a chain, and Whitney stabs him in the chest with his machete. Clay and Whitney dump Jason's body into the lake. Just as they breathe a sigh of relief, Jason bursts through the dock and grabs Whitney, leaving us with a cliffhanger. Fortunately or unfortunately, this was the last film in the franchise. But worry not, for we have a bunch of amazing comics from Friday the 13th. Satan 6 by Tony Isabella. Jason had a pretty strange cameo in Satan 6, a 4-issue comic from Topps Comics. So, let's just get to the story. It's Friday the 13th and Odious Commodious is fed up with his underling Frightful's failures at recruiting souls for Satan. So, in a fit of rage, he decides to summon a new candidate. With a blast and a puff of smoke, who should appear but Jason Voorhees, wielding his trusty machete. The rest of Satan 6 are totally baffled by this new guy, as they have no clue what kind of creature he is. Frightful mocks Odious because he thinks Odious has lost it if he believes Jason is a good replacement, but Odious praises Jason, who immediately starts trying to kill him. Odious calls for backup, and Blue Dragon, Cougar, and Frightful jump in to help but are quickly outmatched by Jason's sheer strength. Desira begs Odious to do something, and after concentrating hard enough, he blasts Jason with a spell. Later, Jason gets teleported somewhere far. Blue Dragon asks where Jason was sent, and Commodious reveals that Jason is heading to the very place that they all want to get into. Jason vs. Leatherface by Nancy A. Collins and David Imhoff. Crystal Lake used to be a summer paradise until Jason Voorhees turned it into a hellish nightmare. His legacy of terror left the place tainted, and the once lovely lake became a toxic wasteland thanks to industrialist Oral Linhart dumping waste into it. But at the bottom of this polluted mess lay Jason, chained but not dead, biding his time for a chance to rise again. That chance came when Linhart and his lackey decided to dredge the lake for a new building project, ignoring an old man's warnings. They hired a guy named Midnight to do the dirty work. Jason got scooped up with the sludge, loaded onto a train, and taken away. Naturally, Jason wakes up and starts doing what he does best, killing. He takes out the train crew, including the driver. Needless to say, the train got derailed and exploded. Of course, Jason walks away from the wreckage unscathed. The train drops Jason in an unfamiliar place, the territory of another infamous killer, Leatherface. In the woods, Jason encounters a terrified man fleeing from Leatherface and his twisted family. Leatherface tries to kill the man, but Jason, true to form, intervenes and takes the kill for himself. He subdues Leatherface, steals his chainsaw, and slices the fleeing man's face in half. Surprisingly, Jason spares Leatherface and his brother, the hitchhiker, for reasons even he doesn't understand. Impressed, the hitchhiker invites Jason to the Sawyer house, where he meets the rest of the twisted family, including the cook, Leatherface's uncle. When Hitchhiker mocks Leatherface for losing his chainsaw, Leatherface retreats to his room to cry, but Jason senses a kindred spirit and asks him to come back. Leatherface and Jason, both outcasts turned killers, start to bond over their shared silence and mutual understanding. At the dinner table, Jason meets the rest of the Sawyers. The family's macabre introduction involves Jason writing his name on the wall in what they call Kool-Aid. But let's be real, it's blood. For the first time, it seems like Jason has found a new family, one as twisted and brutal as he is. Jason crashes at the Sawyer house, and his sleep is haunted by the memory of when he drowned in his childhood. He remembers how the camp counselors had warned him to not go into the water alone, but none of the other kids wanted to be his friend. Tempted by the cool water on a hot summer day, he went in anyway and drowned, with no one there to save him. This nightmare grips him until Cook wakes him up for breakfast. What do we have for breakfast? Well, some good old scrambled brains, which are Hitchhiker's favorite. I don't think I need to mention that they're human brains. During breakfast, Hitchhiker picks a fight with Leatherface and beats him. This triggers another memory for Jason, and he recalls how his father used to beat him for no reason. Yeah, I earlier mentioned that his father was killed by his mother before he was even born. Well, the comics lack continuity and most of them are not really canon. Anyway, Cook then gives Jason a tour of their kitchen and smokehouse. Bodies hang everywhere, some severed, others decapitated. Cook dreams of opening a fancy restaurant someday and shares his demented culinary secrets with Jason. Later, Hitchhiker is set to pick up groceries. Yeah, more humans for their cannibalistic meals. Cook suggests Jason join him. So Jason and Hitchhiker hit the road, kill an elderly couple, and bring back their bodies. Hitchhiker complains that Jason killed the woman too quickly, and they missed out on her screams, while Cook wishes for the tender meat of younger victims. Psycho much? Back from their errand, Hitchhiker shows Jason his art, a rocking chair made of bones for his grandpa's birthday. But Leatherface accidentally destroys it, and the Hitchhiker goes berserk. This again reminds Jason of his father. In that memory, Jason's mother Doris killed his father with a machete to save him. So Jason's mother's name is another inconsistency with the films, where she's Pamela. Moving on, empathizing with Leatherface, Jason slams Hitchhiker away. He's ready to kill him for mistreating Leatherface, but Leatherface, despite his brother's cruelty, stops Jason and Hitchhiker is spared. At supper time, things get heated when Hitchhiker finds out Leatherface has been reading his Iron Man comics. Ready to teach his brother a lesson, Hitchhiker taunts Leatherface about needing a new leather suit. Leatherface, despite being a brutal killer, has always been submissive to his elder brother. Think Hound and the Mountain from Game of Thrones. But Jason, now somewhat protective of Leatherface, steps in and throws Hitchhiker aside. Hitchhiker gets pissed off and stabs Jason in the chest. Clearly, the cannibal doesn't realize who he's dealing with. Jason, unfazed, pulls out his machete and chases Hitchhiker. Cook tries to defend his nephew but quickly gets cornered. Just as Jason is about to finish them off, Leatherface charges in with his chainsaw to attack Jason and runs the chainsaw through Jason's belly. Jason, for the first time, feels the sting of betrayal. He genuinely wanted to protect Leatherface, but now he was having to fight Leatherface. The fight ends when Hitchhiker smashes an arrow into Jason's head. The serial killer's brains spill out. Jason appears dead, and Hitchhiker suggests they eat him. Cook, however, has developed a weird respect for Jason and can't stomach the idea of gulping Jason down his throat. So they decide to blind Jason with ropes and bricks and toss him into a nearby lake. In the end, Leatherface places Jason's machete in his hand and throws a flower into the water after him. It's clear Leatherface feels something for Jason but ultimately chooses his family. But this isn't the end for Jason Voorhees. The cannibals only tied him with ropes, and with his machete, Jason cuts himself free and emerges from the lake. Jason could have easily gone back and killed the cannibals but chooses not to. Maybe he empathizes with them or pities them. It's unclear. What we do know is Jason starts his journey back to Crystal Lake. Jason vs. Jason X. After getting shredded to pieces by KM-14 in the 2002 film Jason X, Jason Voorhees is down to just 13% of his body mass, basically just his head. The nanites on the Grendel go to work and scavenge organic matter from the corpses of Jason's victims to rebuild him. He resurrects in his traditional form, just like the early films. Meanwhile, space scavengers board the Grendel, only to become Jason's new victims. Why were they here in the first place? Well, the lure of high-tech goodies in a futuristic Earth can go a long way. Anyway, Jason starts hunting these people down, and he's driven by the voice of his mother, Pamela, which gives his rage a misplaced rationale. A heavily misplaced rationale, I must say. One by one, the scavengers fall, until only Melda, the pilot, remains. She escapes to the scavenging vessel Pompeii, unaware that Jason is also aboard. She makes an emergency docking on the spaceship Fun Club. Jason follows her and resumes his killing spree by severing noses, crushing necks, and slicing chests. Oh, and the comic is like filled with nudity. A whole lot of it. Anyway, Jason runs into Uber Jason, and a fight between the original and his cybernetic counterpart ensues. The fight is brutal, a clash of undead psychotic titans, with both Jasons landing heavy blows while Melda tries to stay out of the line of fire. She warns other patrons about the danger, but they're too distracted. Needless to say, they end up as collateral damage in the rampage of the two Jasons. Melda finally convinces the staff to call for help, but by then, it's too late. The Jasons are on a killing spree and mow down naked men and women without a second thought, although I don't think they had a first thought about it either. Melda manages to land the Fun Club on Earth 2 near a lake resembling Crystal Lake, but the landing triggers an explosion. Amidst the chaos and flames, the Jasons continue their fight. Machetes clash, blood flies, and the panels are drenched in gore, blood and bones. In the end, Uber Jason overpowers the original and rips out his brain to merge all of it with his own, thereby absorbing all of Jason's memories. With his newfound strength and memories, Uber Jason leaves the wreckage and heads into a nearby forest, ready to continue his endless hunt for more victims. Friday the 13th, Abuser and the Abused. Near a rest station in a park, Maggie gets brutally beaten by her boyfriend Steve. This is the 23rd time he's hit her, and Maggie vows it'll be the last. But how would she ensure that he doesn't raise his hand on her again? The next day, Maggie hides her black eye behind sunglasses and opens her vandalized locker. 3 girls mock her injuries, which is enough to enrage Maggie so much that she smashes her mirror. She thinks every day has been like punishment from God. Every bruise just makes it worse. After school, she visits a guidance counselor who dismisses her claims of abuse as cries for attention. The psychologist she sees next tells her he can't help her unless she opens up. The priest she consults blames her anger and her stepmother's stories. Naturally, Maggie feels utterly alone and helpless. While returning home, Maggie finds her drunk father asleep and her stepmother orders her to a room. Upstairs, Maggie spots a sign reading, "God helps those who help themselves." And Maggie gets an idea. Not a brilliant one, but an idea nonetheless. She calls Steve to tell him she wants to be with him and asks him to pick her up. She grabs a large knife and kills her stepmother as well as her father. When Steve arrives, Maggie climbs out the window and gets into his car, telling him to be quiet because her parents are sleeping. Well, sleeping, they were the everlasting sleep. She tells Steve where to go and promises to make it worth his while. Now, an abusive man like Steve can't really let go on such an offer, can he? It seems that Maggie's descent into violence has begun in addition to the fact that she has a deeper connection to Jason Voorhees. Maggie and Steve arrive at Camp Crystal Lake. She seduces him, takes off her shirt and walks to the lake. Of course, she lures him with the promise of having his way with her. As Steve reaches for her, Maggie suddenly impales him with a knife and rebukes him for hurting her. As Steve fights back and begins to strangle her, he sees Jason Voorhees approaching. Jason strikes Steve with his machete and nearly severs his arm. Maggie stabs Jason in the shoulder, only to be knocked away. With Steve dead, Jason turns his attention to Maggie. In self-defense, she stabs Jason in the chest and manages to knock him down. But he doesn't stay down for long, and as he starts to rise, Maggie grabs his machete and manically stabs him, all the while screaming, "Die! Die! Die!" She thinks that Jason is dead and rushes to Steve's car. She starts it up, muttering, "Never touch me again. Never hurt me." But Jason recovers quickly and flips the car. Maggie sees gas leaking and grabs a lighter. She ignites the gas and the resultant explosion flings both of them into the air. She survives the blast, only to find Jason glaring at her through the smoke. Desperate, she tries to reason with him and tells him that they're the same. She explains that after losing her mother, everyone turned against her, which is what turned her into a monster. Clinging to Jason, she claims she killed to punish and avenge. Jason remains unresponsive until he raises his machete. She correctly understands what he wants and pleads, "But we're the same, please." But he decapitates her all the same. With Maggie dead, Jason goes back into Crystal Lake and takes her body and severed head along with him. Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash. It's December 2008. Will Rollins and Laurie Campbell return to Camp Crystal Lake to confirm Jason and Freddy are gone for good. They split up to investigate and Laurie finds blood on a tree. Not only that, she also hears a noise from a nearby house. Inside, she discovers Will, and not really in a good state. It's not before long that Jason appears, and Laurie flees to the attic, but after grabbing a sword to defend herself, she manages to slice Jason's back and throws him through a window. But when she tries to escape, Jason meets her at the door, shoves his machete into her face, and drags her back inside. Outside, Freddy appears from a signpost and laughs. Meanwhile, at the Mega Super Ultra S-Mart, a group of teenage employees are stacking up Christmas stuff. There's all kinds of lewd banter, like one guy says, "Hey Caroline, wanna suck on my candy cane?" The other replies, "Huh, she's checking on your North Pole, huh, Raoul?" And the girl says, "I lick jingle balls." Anyway, back at Camp Crystal Lake, Jason drags Laurie and Will's bodies to his shack and places Freddy's head next to his mother Pamela's head. Their heads disappear, and Jason is transported into a dream where his younger self is tormented by other campers. To make it worse, he sees his mother making out with Freddy and is told that to get Freddy out of his mind, he needs to retrieve the Necronomicon Ex Mortis from the Voorhees house to become a real boy again. So this is where all the three franchises meet. Anyway, Ash parks his car near the S-Mart and starts walking, and Jason watches him from behind a tree. As Ash enters the S-Mart, the manager greets him. Meanwhile, three girls walk into the woods, and Jason kills one named Paris and two others. An old lady's screams bring Ash outside, where she shouts, "Jason!" Though Ash doesn't see Jason, the cops arrive and cuff him. Fortunately for the Evil Dead hero, the manager vouches for Ash, and he's released. Later, in the S-Mart, Ash tells the employees he's there to destroy the Necronomicon, but they laugh it off. After learning from Caroline about Jason's history, Ash figures that Jason might be a Deadite. Meanwhile, Jason is on his way to the Voorhees house, but gets distracted by carolers and kills them all. That night, the teens tell Ash they're spending the night at the Voorhees house before it's torn down. Ash and Caroline follow them. While the teens make out, Ash heads to the basement for the Necronomicon. Of course, Jason can't stand people making out and kills the teens. While Ash is trying to start his car, Jason throws his machete at the window, but Ash catches it with his metal hand. Heat and Bree jump out just as Jason smashes the car. Ash drops the Necronomicon, but Caroline's minivan crashes into Jason, and Jason finds himself flying into a tree. Ash grabs the Necronomicon, and they drive off with Bree. Back at the S-Mart, Raoul, Dave, and another employee are smoking in a Volkswagen bus when they see the minivan arrive. Ash, Caroline, and Bree get out, and the employees try to hit on Bree until Ash stops them. Inside, Ash explains he needs someone to translate the Necronomicon to send Jason to the Deadite dimension. Suddenly, Jason bursts in and starts killing everyone, including a chubby woman, an old man with a shopping cart, and the manager. Ash shoots at Jason, quipping, "Yo, Wayne Gretzky, hockey fan, huh?" But Jason throws Ash through a wall into a vending machine, grabs the Necronomicon, and kills Bree off-page. Ash, Caroline, and the two employees find Bree's body, and one of them throws up. They decide to head to Caroline's parents' house since they're out of town. Meanwhile, Jason returns to his shack and places the Necronomicon next to Freddy's head, bringing him back to life. Freddy uses the book's power to make Jason intelligent. At Caroline's house, they speculate about why Jason needs the Necronomicon, guessing someone is pulling his strings. They decide to rest before heading back to the Voorhees house to retrieve the book. Ash tries to stay awake but falls asleep and dreams he's in the cabin from Evil Dead, with his right hand back. The hand turns into Freddy's, and Freddy laughs. In the dream, Ash goes to a tool shed, grabs a chainsaw, and cuts off the Freddy hand. Blood drops turn into tiny Freddys, who merge into a full-sized Freddy. He tells Ash he's not a Deadite and attacks him with Freddy hands. Ash wakes up, but Dave doesn't. In his dream, Deadites kill him with dodgeballs, which translates to his death in the real world. Ash, Caroline, and the others head to the S-Mart for weapons, grabbing a silver chainsaw and bombs to blow up the Voorhees house. At the Voorhees house, Ash warns everyone not to get killed. Raoul and Jarvis search for Jason in the woods. When Jason finds them, they run and hide in the minivan. Jason discovers the bombs and approaches Caroline, who hides in the minivan. Meanwhile, Ash finds the Necronomicon in the basement, but Freddy, having absorbed its powers, weakens him. Freddy releases a glowing mist around the house, enraging Jason. Jason charges at Freddy but is attacked by the spirits of his past victims summoned by Freddy. The stage is set for an epic showdown as Jason, driven by rage and the influence of the Necronomicon, battles against both his nemesis and the horrors of his past. Jason tries to grab his machete, but a Freddy hand snatches it and impales him. Freddy realizes the Necronomicon is gone, while Ash runs off with it. Ash gets caught by Deadite-possessed trees and crows, but he bites one crow to death, cuts the trees with his chainsaw, and blasts another crow with his shotgun. He stumbles upon the dead bodies of Raoul and the employee, and then finds Caroline. They see Freddy's face in the clouds and retreat to the Voorhees house. Inside, Ash finds a page in the Necronomicon showing Jason and his mother, Pamela. He tells Caroline that Pamela used the book to resurrect Jason. Ash instructs her to find and read the passage, Klaatu Verata Necto, to send Freddy and Jason to the Deadite dimension. Suddenly, they find themselves at 1428 Elm Street, where three girls sing the Freddy Krueger nursery rhyme. Freddy drags Caroline inside, and Ash is attacked by the three Deadite-possessed girls. He kills them and shoots a Freddy snake. Inside, Freddy tries to take the Necronomicon from Caroline, but Jason breaks in to fight him. Ash joins the fray, shooting off Jason's mask and revealing his deformed face. Caroline tries to recite the passage, but Jason snatches the book. Ash slices off Jason's arm to retrieve it. Jason then attaches his machete to his stump arm and throws Ash out a window, collapsing the Voorhees house. Caroline tries to wake Ash, but he's unconscious. Freddy emerges, taunting her before chasing her onto an icy lake with shacks. Caroline hides, but Freddy uses the Necronomicon's power to destroy each shack until he finds her. He grabs the book, but Jason intervenes. Freddy spews blood and freezes Jason with ice breath, boasting about his plan to dominate the world. Just as Freddy almost says the spell, Ash hits him with his car, beats him up, and shoots him in the groin. Jason throws Ash into the lake. Freddy duplicates himself into 4 clones, and they all attack Jason. Ash climbs out of the frozen lake, and Jason kills all the Freddy clones. Ash shoots Jason in the back, creating a hole. Jason throws Ash at Freddy, who blocks it with a force field. Ash urges Caroline to read the passage. Freddy brags about his impending victory, but Caroline finally reads, Klaatu Verata Nectu. The portal opens, sucking Freddy and the Necronomicon inside. Ash and Caroline hold onto a tree to avoid being pulled in. Jason resists and approaches them, but Ash's car crashes into him, sending him into the frozen lake. The portal closes. The next morning, Ash and Caroline pack up and drive into the sunset, but the portal reopens and the Necronomicon lands on the frozen lake above Jason. The book shows Ash and others preparing to fight Freddy. Jason's eyes open. Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, the Nightmare Warriors. Just 24 hours after the mayhem of Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, Jason Voorhees is stirred from his slumber by an apparition of his mother. She commands him to hunt down and kill Ash Williams. Meanwhile, on the surface, government operatives led by Director Gordon Russell and Agent Wesley Carter arrive at Crystal Lake, aiming to recover the Necronomicon Ex Mortis, which is frozen under a thin layer of ice. They retrieve the book and Russell heads off to the Pentagon to translate it and kickstart Project Black Book. He leaves some agents behind to capture Jason Voorhees. However, Jason thwarts their plans, killing 2 divers before surfacing and attacking the other operatives. With the agents down, Jason sets off to find Ash. 6 months later, on July 2, 2009, in Franklin, Michigan, Ash and his girlfriend Caroline are prepping for a laid-back backyard barbecue and pool party with friends and family. They're interrupted by a visit from Dr. Maggie Burroughs and Dr. Neil Gordon. Maggie explains that they're forming a group of survivors who have faced Freddy and Jason and invites Ash to join. Ash declines, brushing off Maggie's offer. She warns that his peace is probably temporary before leaving. Ash reassures Caroline, dismissing Maggie as a ghost chaser trying to stir up old horrors. Unbeknownst to them, Jason is on the hunt, driven by his mother's apparition and the undying rage that fuels his every move. Believing Ash is right, Caroline asks him to pick up some beer and wine from the store. While he's out, Jason charges toward their house. At that moment, Stephanie Kimball, Jason's great niece, wakes up screaming, warning her father, Stephen Freeman, that Jason has returned. Jason breaks into the house and attacks Caroline. Meanwhile, Alice Johnson, watching a movie with her son Jacob, has a vision of Freddy Krueger. Sensing something's wrong, Ash rushes back home. At the headquarters, Russell tells Carter that the Necronomicon can make America unstoppable, revealing his plan to use the book to bring back Freddy. Ash arrives home to find Caroline dead. Her parents arrive soon after and immediately accuse Ash of murder. Caroline's father, in a rage, attacks Ash. As the police arrive, Ash flees, followed by a mysterious person, later revealed to be Jason's old enemy, Tommy Jarvis. At the Pentagon, the government opens a portal to the Deadite realm, dragging the powerless Freddy back to Earth. Maggie wakes up, sensing her father's return. She wakes Neil, Tina Shepard, and Rennie Wickham, feeling that something bad is on the horizon. Ash heads to Baltimore to meet Maggie and her survivors group. Jason follows, stowing away in a boxcar. Inside, 2 hobos enter and are quickly slaughtered by Jason. Stephanie, taken to Maggie's place, goes into convulsions, envisioning Jason attacking a trio with rapists and their intended victim at a train station shortly before it happens. So, Jason's rampage continues, driven by his dark legacy and the sinister plans of those around him. Classic Voorhees, relentless, unstoppable, and always a step ahead in the game of terror. Freddy Krueger is in custody, given clothes and grilled by director Russell, who's desperate to learn how Freddy went from child killer to supernatural horror. Freddy plays coy until Russell dangles the Necronomicon as bait. Meanwhile, Russell gets word that Jason has been spotted and orders his agents to use tranquilizers only, stressing no more screw-ups. Ash arrives at Maggie's house, furious and blaming her for leading Jason to him and the death of his girlfriend Caroline. Tensions flare and Neil steps in, resulting in a heated argument until Maggie calms things down. As she begins to explain her plan, Stephen barges in, calling the whole ordeal a sham. Suddenly, Jason crashes through the door and kills Stephen right in front of Stephanie. Ash gears up to fight Jason, but Tommy Jarvis dramatically crashes his Hummer through the wall, shouting for everyone to get in. They speed off while Jason recovers, with Tommy revealing his mission to finally destroy Jason. Agents soon arrive at Maggie's place and manage to subdue Jason with bullets and missiles. The survivors hide out in a motel, where Maggie suggests using the Necronomicon to defeat the killers. Tommy, unimpressed, goes solo. Meanwhile, Jason is locked up in a Capitol holding cell, where Freddy visits him. Freddy proposes an alliance to rule the world, but Jason initially wants to kill him. Freddy convinces Jason by revealing that his old enemies, including Tommy, are coming for them. Jason agrees and is appointed as the general of the Deadites, with Freddy repairing his decomposed body. The group, minus Stephanie and Jacob who stay at the motel, head to the Capitol. Maggie, Neil, and Rennie are taken to see Freddy, who reveals his true form and newfound powers from the Necronomicon. Russell tries to attack Freddy with his own glove, but Maggie turns the blades on him, killing him. Maggie then reveals her true identity as Catherine Krueger, Freddy's daughter, and attacks Neil and Rennie. Sensing Rennie's death, Tina uses her telekinesis to break out of a cell. She, Ash, and Alice escape as Jason and his Deadite army descend on Washington. As Tommy opens fire on Jason, winged Deadites snatch him away to Freddy. Back at the motel, Jacob and Stephanie fall asleep, and Freddy possesses Stephanie. In a twisted scene, Freddy seduces and attacks Jacob, forcing him to call out to his mother. Alice uses her Dream Master powers to transport herself, Ash, and Tina into Jacob's nightmare. Immobilized by Freddy, Ash watches as Freddy spares Stephanie and escapes with Jacob. Still in the dreamscape, Tina and Alice restore Stephanie's skin, waking her up unharmed. At the White House, Freddy, Jason, and the traitor Maggie hold Tommy and Jacob hostage. Disguised as the president, Freddy addresses the nation, unveiling his No Kid Left Alive policy and his plan to visit every green place on Earth, bringing destruction. Ash and the girls, having seen Freddy's broadcast, break into a pawn shop for weapons and head to the White House to stop the massacre. As it rains blood in DC, Ash, Alice, Tina, and Stephanie plan their infiltration. Upset by Ash and Alice's bickering, Stephanie wanders off alone. The group gets the distraction they need when an army of soldiers arrives to rescue the president. Tanks, helicopters, and jets battle Deadites, but the soldiers suffer heavy losses. Freddy manifests in the clouds, blasting helicopters out of the sky. Stephanie passes out and meets Freddy, who tells her it's her destiny to become a murderer like Jason. With a hockey mask, Stephanie leaves the church. Back at the White House, Freddy plans to destroy all countries and drain Tommy's special powers. Maggie and Jason brawl until Tina crashes a tank into the room, crushing Maggie. Ash rescues Neil, Jacob, and Tommy, while Alice confronts Freddy. She reveals her terminal illness and weakened Dream Master abilities, allowing Freddy to kill her and pass her power to Jacob. As she dies, she releases the souls Freddy has killed in the previous Nightmare on Elm Street films. Furious at his mother's death, Jacob declares himself the new Dream Master, surrounded by the spirits of Amanda Kruger and the Dream Warriors. Jason, relentless as ever, is in the thick of it, caught in a battle that mixes the supernatural chaos of Freddy and the brute force of Ash. Classic Voorhees, unstoppable, terrifying, and smack in the middle of an epic horror showdown. As Amanda and the other souls destroy the Deadite army, Freddy mortally wounds Jacob, severing their connection to Earth. Tina tends to Jacob while Ash battles Freddy. Meanwhile, Tommy takes on Jason, taunting him for never being able to kill him. Stephanie appears and impales Jason with a machete, giving Tommy the chance to decapitate Jason with a shard of glass. However, Freddy seizes this moment, absorbing Jason's soul to boost his own power. Neil struggles to read the Necronomicon's passages to banish Freddy, but is joined by the spirits of Nancy Thompson. Together, they recite the words, opening a portal to the Deadite dimension. Freddy resists the vortex until the Dream Demons declare him unworthy, stripping him of his powers. As a human, Freddy begs for forgiveness. Ash blasts him into the vortex with his shotgun. Nancy's spirit leaves to join the others. In the aftermath, we see Jason's hand feeling for his head, with Mrs. Voorhees' voice reassuring him that he can never die. The next morning, Ash bids farewell to Tommy, Tina, Neil, Jacob, and Stephanie, appointing Tommy as the new captain of the Nightmare Warriors. Meanwhile, in a twist of fate, a time-displaced Agent Wes Carter, sucked into the Necronomicon's vortex, finds himself in the Springwood Police Department in 1964. Disoriented, he impulsively signs Freddy's search warrant, altering the course of history and the events of a Nightmare on Elm Street film. That was all in this Mega Jason video. Stick around for more. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks, everyone.